What if the person who saved your life became the only thing worth living for? Nicholas Calloway had it all: power, wealth, and an empire under his command. But when a sabotaged accident left him in a coma for over a year, the world moved on. Except for her. Evelyn, the nurse who refused to leave his side, became the reason he fought his way back. But waking up was only the beginning. A betrayal, a dangerous truth, and an unexpected love would change everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Evelyn Harper had spent nearly 3 years walking the pristine white halls of Lexington Private Hospital, but today felt different. The moment she received the unexpected summons to Dr. Mitchell Vaughn's office, a strange unease settled in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Was she being transferred? Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the polished mahogany door. "Come in," Dr. Vaughn's voice called from inside. She stepped in cautiously. The room smelled of antiseptic and expensive leather, a stark contrast to the warmth she tried to bring to her patients. Dr. Vaughn stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes locked on the city skyline. He was always composed, but today there was a heaviness in the air, something unspoken lingering between them. "Evelyn," he said finally, turning to face her, "I have a special assignment for you." Her brows furrowed. "Special?" He gestured toward a thick medical file on his desk. Nicholas Calloway. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. Nicholas Calloway. Even if she hadn't recognized it instantly, the black and white newspaper clipping attached to the file made it clear. A devastating car crash from over a year ago. The youngest billionaire in the city, the man who built a financial empire before 30, had been in a coma ever since. She swallowed hard. Everyone knew the story. His sports car had veered off the road one stormy night, plunging into a ravine. By some miracle, he had survived, but he had never woken up. He was now nothing more than a ghost, trapped in his own body. "I thought he was under private care," she said carefully. Dr. Vaughn nodded. "He is. His family arranged for the best, but they rarely visit. The medical staff rotates through out of obligation, but what he needs is someone dedicated, someone who will actually care." Evelyn hesitated. She could hear the unspoken weight in his words. Most of the staff had given up hope. Nicholas Calloway was just another patient. A famous name, a once powerful man, now reduced to silence. "And you think that someone is me?" she asked. Dr. Vaughn studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, I do." A slow breath escaped her lips. It was daunting, the idea of caring for someone who might never wake up. But as overwhelming as it was, she already knew her answer before she spoke. "I'll do it." A flicker of approval passed through Dr. Vaughn's eyes. "Your shift starts tonight." The private suite on the top floor of the hospital felt eerily quiet as Evelyn stepped inside. Unlike the sterile, impersonal rooms downstairs, this one was designed for luxury. A spacious layout, soft chandelier lighting, dark oak furniture, everything about it screamed wealth. But despite the richness of its furnishings, there was something profoundly lonely about it. And then, in the center of the room, lay him. Evelyn's breath caught as she took in Nicholas Calloway for the first time. He was nothing like the cold, distant image of him that had once dominated business magazines. The machines kept him alive, the rhythmic hum of the ventilator blending with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. His dark lashes cast shadows over his pale skin, and though his body had lost some of the strength he must have once carried, there was still something imposing about him, even in stillness. If not for the lifeless quiet surrounding him, he could have simply been a man in deep sleep. She stepped closer, adjusting his IV drip before reaching for the warm cloth prepared for him. She hesitated for just a moment before pressing it gently against his skin, wiping his face with careful precision. A strange sensation ran through her, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had bathed unconscious patients before, but this felt different, like he could feel her there. A soft beep from the heart monitor filled the silence, steady and rhythmic. Evelyn shook off the odd feeling and continued her work, her fingers moving methodically. "He doesn't get a say in this, does he?" she mused, voice barely above a whisper. Silence. She exhaled a small laugh. "I'll take that as a no." She didn't expect an answer, but somehow, in the quiet of the room, she felt less alone. The days turned into routine. Every morning and night, Evelyn bathed him, changed his sheets, monitored his vitals, but soon it became more than just medical care. She talked to him. "You should see the cafeteria food, Nick. It's tragic. Even for a billionaire, I doubt you'd survive it." Silence. "I don't even know why I'm talking to you," she admitted one evening, adjusting the blanket over his still form. "Maybe I just like the sound of my own voice." Silence again. She let out a small sigh. "Or maybe you're actually listening." The heart monitor beeped steadily, almost as if answering her. She shook her head, imagining things. But then one evening, as she leaned over to adjust his pillow, she felt it. A faint pressure against her wrist. She froze. Had she imagined it? Her gaze snapped downward. His fingers lay motionless against the crisp white sheets. A nervous laugh escaped her. "Great. Now I'm hallucinating." But the unease lingered. And then, a few days later, it happened again. This time, she wasn't looking when she felt it. The faintest shift. Just a fraction of an inch as she cleaned his arm. Her breath hitched. "Nick," she whispered, hardly realizing she had spoken his name. Silence. She reached for his hand, pressing her fingers lightly against his skin. He was warm, real, alive. Was she imagining things, or was something changing? The feeling gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. That night, she went straight to Dr. Vaughn. "He moved," she said, almost breathless. "I know it sounds crazy, but I felt it." His fingers twitched. His hand shifted. It wasn't just a reflex. Dr. Vaughn arched a skeptical brow, but didn't dismiss her outright. "We'll run tests." She nodded, but deep down, she already knew the truth. Something was happening. And she wasn't ready for what came next. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor had become background noise to Evelyn. It was always there. Steady, unchanging, a reminder that Nicholas Calloway was alive, but not truly living. She had settled into a routine now. Every morning and evening she cared for him. But what had started as a clinical duty had shifted into something far more personal. She didn't just tend to his medical needs. She talked to him, and somewhere along the way, she stopped feeling foolish for doing so. "You know, Nick," she murmured as she dipped a warm cloth into a basin of water, wringing it out with practiced ease. "I read somewhere that people in comas can still hear things." She pressed the cloth gently against his cheek, wiping away the faint sheen of perspiration that had gathered on his skin. "So technically, you're the worst listener I've ever met." Silence. A small smile tugged at her lips. Not even a twitch of protest. Still, nothing. She sighed, shaking her head. "It's okay. I'm used to talking to myself." As she moved to clean along the curve of his jaw, something flickered at the end of her vision. A movement, so faint, she almost dismissed it. But then, her breath caught. His fingers. She froze, her pulse spiking. Did she imagine that? She stared at his hand, but it remained still against the sheets. Exhaling a shaky laugh, she shook her head. Great, now I'm hallucinating. Still, the unease settled deep in her bones. Over the next few days, it happened again, and again. The second time, she was adjusting his pillow, her focus elsewhere, when she felt it. A subtle pressure against her wrist. Her head snapped down, but once more his hand lay still. She pressed her lips together, the memory of it nagging at her. Reflex, she told herself. But she couldn't shake the feeling. The third time, it wasn't just a twitch. It was a shift. She was mid-sentence, ranting about a doctor who had stolen her coffee from the staff lounge when Nicholas's fingers moved. Just slightly, just enough for her to see. Her breath hitched. "Nick," she whispered, heart hammering. Silence. She hesitated, then cautiously reached out, brushing her fingertips against his. His skin was warm, real, alive. And then, the faintest twitch. A rush of adrenaline surged through her. She swallowed hard, pressing her hand against his, searching for any more signs of movement. Nothing. But she had seen it. Her mind raced. Reflexive movements were common in coma patients, but this felt different. Intentional. That night, she went straight to Dr. Vaughn. "He moved," she told him, her voice firm. "I know it sounds crazy, but I saw it." His fingers twitched. His hand shifted. It's small, but it's there. Dr. Vaughn studied her carefully before leaning back in his chair, deep in thought. "We'll run tests," he finally said. "But don't get your hopes up too high, Evelyn. It could just be residual muscle activity." Evelyn nodded, but deep down, she didn't believe that. She felt it in her bones. Something was happening. The next morning, when the test results came back, she wasn't surprised. "There's increased brain activity," Dr. Vaughn told her. "His neurological responses are stronger than before." Evelyn's heart leaped. "So, he's waking up?" Dr. Vaughn hesitated. "Not necessarily. It could mean a lot of things. But it's a good sign." It wasn't the definitive answer she wanted, but it was enough. That night, she sat beside Nicholas's bed, her fingers absently tracing the edge of his blanket. "I don't know if you can hear me," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "but something tells me you can." She glanced at him, the sharp angles of his face softened by the dim glow of the bedside lamp. He looked peaceful. Or at least, he had looked peaceful. Because for the first time since she had known him, he stirred. Her breath caught. It was just the smallest motion. A shift of his fingers, the slightest furrow of his brow, but it sent a jolt through her. She wasn't imagining this. A slow, uncertain hope built inside her. And so, she talked. She told him about her day, about the patients who frustrated her, about the rude doctor on the third floor who always stole her coffee. She told him about her childhood, about the small town she grew up in, about how she had always dreamed of being a nurse. And as she spoke, she didn't realize that, deep in the silence of his coma, Nicholas Calloway was listening. The days passed, and the signs became undeniable. More twitches, more small movements, more reactions. The heart monitor would spike slightly when she spoke. His fingers would flex when she touched his hand. His eyelids would flutter, as though he were trying to wake up. Then, one morning, as she gently wiped his chest with a warm cloth, his fingers closed around her wrist, Evelyn froze. The contact was weak, fragile, barely there, but it was real. Her heart pounded so violently she could barely breathe. "Nick," she whispered, staring at his hand. His grip was hesitant, uncertain, but unmistakable. She wasn't crazy. He was waking up. Panic and hope warred inside her as she stumbled back, nearly knocking over the basin of water. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the emergency button and pressed it hard. The alarm blared through the hallway. Seconds later, the door burst open, a flood of doctors and nurses rushing in. "What happened?" Dr. Vaughn demanded, as he moved swiftly to the bedside, already checking Nicholas's vitals. Evelyn's voice shook. He grabbed my hand. He moved." She turned back to Nicholas, her breath catching. His eyes were open. For the first time in over a year, Nicholas Calloway was awake. The room erupted into chaos. Nurses scrambled to adjust the monitors, doctors fired rapid questions, orders were barked. But Evelyn barely registered any of it, because Nicholas was looking at her. His deep blue eyes were dazed, unfocused, filled with confusion, but they were alive. He was alive. His lips parted, and for a moment, nothing came out. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, he whispered a single word. "Evelyn." Her entire world stopped. She had spent months speaking to a man who had never responded, months watching for a sign, any sign, that he was still there. And now, he knew her name. A tremor ran through her as she met his gaze, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. "Nick," she whispered, stepping closer. Do you know where you are?" His brows furrowed slightly, his breathing shaky. He struggled to process everything around him, the flood of sounds and sensations after so long in silence. Then, finally, he rasped, "What happened?" Evelyn swallowed hard, emotion thick in her throat. "You were in an accident," she said gently. "You've been in a coma for over a year." A flicker of something crossed his expression. Confusion, frustration, something else she couldn't quite name. And then his hand, still weak, still trembling, reached out, not randomly, for her. She took it, her fingers wrapping gently around his. "I've got you," she whispered, and in that moment, as the chaos of the room swirled around them, one undeniable truth settled deep in her bones. He had fought his way back. For her. The steady hum of the heart monitor filled the room, an ever-present rhythm Evelyn had grown accustomed to. But now, something had changed. He was awake. Nicholas Calloway lay still, his body weak, his breathing unsteady, but his eyes were open. A deep shade of blue, unfocused yet searching. It had been over a year since those eyes had last seen the world, since his voice had last formed words. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched his trembling hand. "Nick," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whirlwind of movement around them. Doctors shouted orders, nurses adjusted monitors, but none of it mattered. Not in that moment. His gaze locked onto hers. "Eve, Lynn." Her breath hitched. His voice was rough, hoarse from disuse, but he had said her name. He knew her. A flood of emotions rushed through her. Relief, disbelief, something deeper that she couldn't quite name. Dr. Vaughn pushed past her, stepping to the bedside with his stethoscope.
"Nicholas, can you hear me?"
Nick blinked sluggishly, his brows drawing together as if forming a thought required too much effort. He tried to speak again, but only a strained exhale escaped his lips. It's okay, Evelyn reassured him gently, still gripping his hand. You don't have to talk yet. You're safe. Dr. Vaughn leaned closer. Nicholas, do you know where you are? Nick's fingers twitched against hers. He swallowed hard, his throat working to produce sound. A few painful seconds passed before he rasped, Hospital. Dr. Vaughn nodded approvingly. Good. Do you remember what happened? A shadow passed over Nick's face. His eyes flickered, scanning the unfamiliar room, searching for answers he couldn't seem to find. Finally, he exhaled a frustrated breath. No. No. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. Dr. Vaughn didn't look surprised. That's normal. Your body has been in a coma for quite some time. Your memory might take a while to return. Nick's fingers curled slightly, his frustration evident even in his weakened state. How long? Evelyn hesitated, unsure if she should be the one to tell him. But when his eyes met hers again, she knew she couldn't lie. 14 months, she said softly. His breath hitched. His gaze flickered to the ceiling, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. She could almost see the weight of that realization crashing down on him. A year, more than a year, gone. Nick closed his eyes, his expression unreadable. Dr. Vaughn continued his assessment, testing Nick's motor responses, pupil dilation, reflexes. Evelyn could tell he was impressed by the level of response, but she also knew Nick was far from okay. We'll need to run neurological tests to assess your brain function, Dr. Vaughn explained. Physical therapy will be necessary to regain muscle strength. Nick didn't react. He lay there, his breathing slow and measured, his mind somewhere far away. Dr. Vaughn glanced at Evelyn. Stay with him. Talk to him. He needs familiarity right now. Evelyn nodded as the medical team slowly filtered out, leaving her alone with the man who had just woken from the dead. A heavy silence stretched between them. Nick's gaze drifted back to her, as if studying her for the first time. She forced a small smile. You scared me, you know. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. You really don't remember anything? She asked gently. Nick inhaled deeply, his brows furrowing in concentration. It's blank, just flashes. Flashes? His fingers twitched against the blanket. A road, headlights, a feeling. Evelyn swallowed. What kind of feeling? He hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Something was wrong. A chill ran down her spine. She knew what the police reports had said. The official ruling had been mechanical failure, but she had seen the autopsy of his car. His brakes hadn't simply malfunctioned. They had been tampered with. Nick, she said cautiously, if you can't remember, don't force it. It'll come back in time. He was still looking at her, still searching. How do I know you? The question caught her off guard. She swallowed the lump in her throat, unsure how to explain it. I've been taking care of you. Since I was assigned to your case, No, his fingers twitched slightly. Before, her pulse stopped. What? What? His gaze flickered with uncertainty, but there was something solid beneath the fog of confusion. I don't remember, but I feel like I should. A breath shuddered through her. That wasn't possible. They had never met before. She had been assigned to him long after his accident. Hadn't she? Evelyn forced a reassuring smile. You were unconscious for a long time, Nick. Maybe you just got used to hearing my voice. Nick didn't look convinced, but exhaustion was already settling over him. She reached for his blanket, adjusting it carefully. You should rest. You've been asleep for over a year. You have a lot of catching up to do. His breathing slowed, his fingers relaxing slightly. But just as she thought he had fallen asleep, his voice broke through the silence again. "You stayed." Evelyn's hands froze. "What?" His eyelids were heavy, his voice a mere whisper. "You stayed," he repeated, softer this time. "Why?" She didn't have an answer. At least not one she was ready to admit. Instead, she whispered, "Because you weren't alone." His lashes fluttered, and then, finally, Nicholas Calloway drifted back into sleep. But this time, he wasn't lost in the darkness. Evelyn sat back in the chair beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall. Something had shifted between them, something undeniable. And for the first time since she had started taking care of him, she realized Nicholas Calloway wasn't the only one waking up. So was she. Nicholas Calloway was awake, but he was far from whole. His body, weakened by over a year of stillness, refused to obey him. His mind, once sharp and relentless, was now a fractured puzzle, missing too many pieces. And worst of all, his memories, the foundation of who he was, had been stripped away, leaving only flashes of images, fleeting sensations of something wrong, and a darkness where answers should be. Evelyn watched him struggle through it all. Days turned into weeks, and with every new sunrise, he fought to reclaim his body. Physical therapy was grueling. His muscles, stiff and uncooperative, betrayed him at every turn. He hated the dependency, the helplessness that clung to him like a suffocating fog. The man he had been, a ruthless, powerful CEO, would have never tolerated such weakness. But now, he had no choice but to accept it. Evelyn was his anchor. She was there every step of the way, coaxing him through each frustrating attempt to move, to sit up, to stand on his own. She never pitied him, never spoke to him like he was fragile. She believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. And yet, something still gnawed at him. The accident. The memories. The feeling that something about that night wasn't just bad luck. "I don't understand why I can't remember," he muttered one evening, gripping the arms of his wheelchair. He hated being in it, but his legs still weren't strong enough to carry him far. "You'd think after a year my brain would give me something." Evelyn, sitting across from him, leaned forward. "Dr. Vaughn said it's normal for trauma survivors to block out painful memories. Your brain is protecting you." Nick exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "I don't need protection. I need the truth." His fingers curled into fists. Evelyn saw the frustration in his posture, in the way his shoulders tensed, his brows furrowed. She hesitated before asking, "Do you remember anything new?" Nick was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Flashes. Sensations. He ran a hand over his face, trying to pull the fragments into something tangible. There was rain. The road was slick. I remember my hands gripping the steering wheel. Evelyn's stomach clenched. "What else?" she pressed gently. Nick's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The brakes. His voice was quiet, rough. "I remember hitting them, and nothing happened." A shiver ran down her spine. She had seen the report. She knew what had been written in the accident reconstruction analysis. Brake failure. Not worn out brakes. Not bad timing. Tampered. Tampered. Nick let out a bitter laugh. And the worst part, I don't even remember where I was going, who I was with before. The last conversation I had before it happened. It's like a whole part of my life was just gone. Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap. She debated telling him. Debated not telling him. But deep down, she already knew. Nick wasn't the kind of man who wanted to be protected from the truth. She took a slow breath. Nick, I think your accident wasn't just an accident. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. What? She stood, walking over to the small bedside drawer where she had tucked away something she never should have seen. Something she had taken from the hospital archives weeks ago. A file. Nick's accident report. She turned, handing it to him. I read this a while ago, she admitted. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, when you started remembering, I thought you should know. Nick's fingers trembled slightly as he opened the file, flipping through the pages. His expression hardened as he read the analysis of the crash. And then, his hands stilled. Evelyn knew the exact moment he saw it. A note in the investigator's report. The brake lines were deliberately cut. Nick's pulse pounded in his ears. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he exhaled, closing the file with a quiet snap. So someone tried to kill me. His voice was eerily calm, but Evelyn could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. We don't know that for sure, she said carefully. It could have been. Nick cut her off with a sharp look. Don't. She fell silent. Nick turned his gaze back to the file, his jaw tightening. No one sabotages a car's brakes by accident. Someone wanted me off the road that night. A muscle in his cheek ticked. The question is, who? Evelyn swallowed hard. She had no answer. But she did know one thing. If someone had tried to kill Nicholas Calloway once, there was nothing stopping them from trying again. Nick's hand pressed against his forehead as he leaned back against the chair, lost in thought. Evelyn could see it. The wheels in his head turning, the sharp, calculating mind of a man who had once built an empire from nothing. He was waking up. Not just physically, but the man he used to be, and whoever had tried to bury him a year ago, they were about to regret it. Nicholas Calloway couldn't sleep. His mind was a battlefield, fragments of memories flashing like gunfire in the dark. The brakes, the rain, the road vanishing beneath him. The feeling, that gut-wrenching certainty that something was wrong, that the crash hadn't been an accident. Now, staring at the ceiling of his hospital suite, the truth burned in his chest. Someone had tried to kill him. And for over a year, they had almost succeeded. He wasn't going to let that stand. He pushed himself up in bed, grimacing as his muscles protested. Recovery had been slow, too slow. But he wasn't the lifeless figure in that bed anymore. He wasn't the lifeless figure in that bed anymore. He was coming back, and he was going to find whoever had done this. Evelyn had left hours ago, but she would be back in the morning. She was always there, the one person who hadn't abandoned him. The thought sent a strange warmth through him, something unfamiliar and dangerous, but he shoved it aside. Feelings could wait. Vengeance couldn't. He reached for the tablet on his bedside table, swiping through financial records, business reports, anything that might hold a clue. Someone had wanted him out of the way. He just had to figure out why. A knock at the door made him tense. He quickly set the tablet down, forcing his expression into something neutral. Dr. Vaughn stepped inside, flipping through Nick's latest test results. You're improving, Vaughn said, scanning the report. Faster than expected. Nick leaned back. I was never much for following expectations. Dr. Vaughn smirked. Clearly, he paused, lowering the clipboard. How's your memory? Nick hesitated. Pieces. Enough to know someone wanted me dead. Vaughn's expression didn't change, but Nick caught the way his grip on the clipboard tightened slightly. Interesting. And what do you plan to do with that information? Vaughn asked. Nick shrugged. Figure out who did it. Make them regret it. Dr. Vaughn sighed. I had a feeling you'd say that. He set the clipboard down and folded his arms. Be careful, Calloway. If someone was willing to sabotage your car, they won't hesitate to try again. Nick's jaw clenched. Let them try. Vaughn exhaled, shaking his head. You should be focusing on recovery, not revenge. Nick's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. What's the difference? Dr. Vaughn didn't have an answer. When the doctor finally left, Nick reached for his tablet again. He had work to do. The next morning, Evelyn walked into Nick's room, a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. She froze when she saw him. He was sitting up, fully dressed, legs planted firmly on the ground. The hospital, issued sweatpants and t-shirt, looked strange on him. He was the kind of man who belonged in tailored suits, not rehab clothes. But it wasn't his outfit that made her stare. It was his expression. Sharp, determined. Like the man who had built a billion-dollar empire had finally woken up. Her stomach twisted. You're not supposed to be up yet, she said cautiously. Nick glanced at her, blue eyes cool and unreadable. Then, it's a good thing I don't listen well. She sighed, setting the coffee down. Nick, I need your help. She blinked. With what? He motioned toward the tablet on his lap. I've been going through financial records. There were some unusual transfers in the weeks leading up to my accident. Evelyn frowned. Unusual? How? Nick swiped the screen, turning it toward her. A large wire transfer, several $1,000,000. The recipient, a man with a history of orchestrating staged accidents. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This guy, she swallowed hard. He was paid to sabotage your car? Nick's jaw tightened. Looks that way. Evelyn felt sick. It was one thing to suspect foul play. It was another to see proof. She looked back at him. Who sent the money? Nick's fingers hovered over the screen. He already knew the answer. He turned the tablet back toward himself, swiping again. A name appeared. Evelyn's breath caught. Oliver Calloway, Nick's half-brother. The realization hit like a freight train. Nick exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. It was him. Evelyn could barely process it. Your own brother? Nick let out a humorless laugh.
You sound surprised.
I am surprised, Nick. He's your family. Nick's fingers curled into a fist. Evelyn swallowed hard, watching the war playing out in his expression. This wasn't just betrayal. This was personal. Why would he do this? She asked quietly. Nick didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the window, jaw tightening. Oliver's always hated me, he said finally. Resented me for being the one our father left the company to. He thought he deserved it more. Evelyn felt her heart sink. So he tried to get rid of you. Nick nodded, and for a year he thought he succeeded. A sharp silence settled between them. Then, finally, Nick looked at her. We're going to confront him. Evelyn's stomach flipped. Nick, you don't have to come, he cut in, but I am doing this. She hesitated. Every instinct in her screamed that this was dangerous. But she also knew something else. Nick wasn't going to walk away from this. And if he wasn't walking away, neither was she. She met his gaze, determination settling in her bones. I'm coming with you. For the first time that morning, Nick smiled. And just like that, their fate was sealed. That evening, Nick and Evelyn arrived at the Calloway estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, its towering windows glowing with golden light. Nick's grip tightened on the cane he still had to use for balance. His body wasn't at full strength yet, but his mind was sharper than ever. Evelyn stood beside him, heart pounding. "Are you sure about this?" Nick didn't answer. He just stepped forward. They walked through the grand entrance, the butler barely sparing Nick a glance before ushering them inside. The moment they stepped into the dimly lit study, Oliver was already there, lounging in a leather chair, swirling a glass of whiskey. "Well, well," Oliver smirked, leaning back. "The dead man walks." Nick's fingers curled into fists. Evelyn swallowed hard. The tension in the room was suffocating. Nick took a slow step forward. "I know what you did." Oliver's smirk didn't falter. "Do you?" Nick tossed the tablet onto the desk, the financial records flashing on the screen. Oliver's expression finally shifted. Just slightly. But Nick saw it. The flicker of fear. The truth was out. And Nicholas Calloway? He was done playing dead. The silence in the Calloway estate study was razor sharp, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of betrayal. Nicholas stood firm, gripping his cane tightly, his body still recovering but his mind sharper than ever. Across the dimly lit room, Oliver lounged in his chair, swirling his whiskey with an infuriating smirk, as if this was nothing more than a casual inconvenience. Nick had imagined this confrontation 1,000 times since waking up, but now that he was here, staring into the eyes of the man who had tried to kill him, something inside him burned. Rage, cold and unrelenting. "I know what you did," Nick said, his voice controlled but deadly. Oliver took a slow sip of his drink before meeting Nick's gaze. "Do you?" Nick didn't look away. "You paid to have my brakes sabotaged." A flicker. Just a flicker. Of something crossed Oliver's face before the smirk returned. "That's a strong accusation." Nick reached into his jacket, pulled out his tablet, and tossed it onto the desk. The screen lit up, displaying the financial records. The wire transfer. Evidence so damning, it left no room for lies. Oliver's smirk faded. Not completely, but enough. Evelyn, standing just behind Nick, could feel the shift in the air. The tension between the brothers crackled like a live wire, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Nick took a step forward. His body still carried the weaknesses of recovery, but his presence, unbreakable. "You were always jealous," Nick continued, voice low. "Always bitter that Dad chose me. But instead of proving yourself, you went for the easy way out." His jaw tightened. "You tried to kill me." Oliver let out a sharp laugh, setting his glass down with a deliberate clink. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it was, growing up in your shadow? You. Nick Calloway, the golden boy, the heir to it all, while I was the spare." His fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. "You got everything, Nick. The company, the power, the goddamn legacy. And me." His voice dropped into something cold, something venomous. "I got to watch." Nick clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "So instead of earning your place, you tried to erase me." Oliver leaned forward, his eyes gleaming, "And for 14 months, I did." Evelyn sucked in a breath. There it was, the confession. Nick's body coiled with rage. Every muscle screamed for him to move, to strike, to make his brother feel even an ounce of the pain he had endured. But he didn't. He wouldn't give Oliver that satisfaction. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing, dangerous smile. "You should have made sure I stayed dead." Oliver's expression faltered for the first time. Before he could react, the door burst open. Two uniformed officers strode inside, guns at their sides, their presence radiating authority. "Oliver Calloway," one of them said firmly, "you're under arrest for attempted murder." Oliver shot to his feet. "What the hell is this?" Nick didn't move. He didn't need to. Evelyn, standing at his side, spoke softly. "We recorded everything." Oliver's face drained of color. Nick tilted his head. "That's the thing about being the golden boy, Oliver. People actually want to see me alive." The officers grabbed Oliver by the arms. He struggled, twisting violently, but there was nowhere to go. "This is bullshit," Oliver snarled. "You think this changes anything? You think the board is just going to let you walk back in after being a ghost for a year?" He sneered, voice dripping with venom. "You don't belong here anymore, Nick. You're damaged goods." Nick met his brother's eyes and smiled again. "You're right." He let the words hang in the air before finishing, "But I'm still standing. And you'll be rotting in a cell." The officers dragged Oliver away, his curses echoing down the hall, but Nick didn't look back. He had spent too long in the past. It was time to move forward. The moment they stepped out of the estate, the night air felt different, lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted. Evelyn glanced at Nick, watching his expression carefully. He had just taken down his own brother, yet he looked steady, unshaken. She should have expected nothing less. Nick exhaled, rolling his shoulders, as if letting go of something invisible. "Well," he said dryly, "that was long overdue." Evelyn snorted. "You think?" His lips twitched, but the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted between them. "You didn't have to come with me," he said after a moment. "But you did." Evelyn's chest tightened. "You weren't going to do this alone." Something unreadable flickered across his face. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady. Evelyn's breath caught. Nick Calloway had built his life on being untouchable. But now, standing here, with his hand wrapped around hers, he wasn't pushing her away. Instead, he was pulling her closer. And she wasn't going anywhere. The rain had started falling just as they left the Calloway estate. Light at first, barely more than mist against the pavement, but now it drummed steadily against the car windows, filling the silence between them. Nick drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, his fingers drumming absently. It was the first time he had driven since the accident. The cane was gone, his body stronger now, but the phantom pain of that night still lingered somewhere deep in his bones. Evelyn sat beside him, stealing glances at his face. The tension in his jaw hadn't eased since Oliver had been dragged away in cuffs, and she wasn't sure if it was from anger, relief, or something else entirely. He hadn't spoken much since they left. "Nick," she said softly, "it's over." His grip on the wheel tightened. "Is it?" Evelyn frowned. "Oliver's going to prison. He's not coming back from this." Nick exhaled through his nose, staring straight ahead. That doesn't change the fact that he tried. Tried to kill him. Tried to erase him. Tried, and almost succeeded. Evelyn bit her lip, glancing at his hands. His knuckles were white, but his fingers trembled just slightly. A sign of a man holding too much inside. "Pull over," she said suddenly. Nick's brows furrowed. "What?" "Just, please, pull over." He hesitated, but something in her voice made him listen. With a smooth motion, he eased the car onto the shoulder of the quiet road, cutting the engine. The rain drummed harder now. The world outside blurred through streaks of water. Evelyn turned in her seat, facing him fully. "Talk to me." Nick let out a breath, leaning his head back against the seat. There's nothing to say. You don't have to do that. Do what? Pretend. His jaw tensed. She reached for his hand, covering it with hers. He didn't pull away. You're alive, Nick, she whispered. You won. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I spent 14 months in a coma while the world moved on without me. The company I built, I have to fight to get it back. My brother, the only family I had left, tried to kill me. I lost over a year of my life. And for what? He turned to her, blue eyes dark, haunted. She swallowed hard. You won me, she almost said. But she didn't. Instead, she tightened her grip on his hand. You won another chance. Nick stared at her, his gaze searching. Then, after a long moment, his shoulders slumped. The exhaustion he had been carrying, not just from the confrontation with Oliver, but from everything, seemed to finally settle in. Evelyn reached for the keys, twisting them out of the ignition. Come on. His brow lifted. Come on. We're getting out. Nick gave her a look. It's raining. She shrugged, pushing open the door. So... She stepped out into the downpour, tilting her head up as the cool rain soaked through her clothes, her hair. The air smelled fresh, clean, free. She turned back to the car. Are you really going to sit there and sulk while I'm out here having an epiphany? Nick let out a sigh, but she caught the flicker of amusement in his eyes. A moment later, the door opened and he stepped out. The rain clung to his skin, his dark hair dripping, his t-shirt plastered to his frame. For a second, he just stood there, watching her. You're insane, he muttered. Evelyn grinned. And yet, here you are. A breath of something close to laughter escaped him. She took a step toward him. Tell me something. Nick arched a brow. What? Why did you fight so hard to wake up? His smirk faded. Evelyn waited. Then, in a voice barely above the rain, he said, I don't know. She tilted her head. I think you do. He exhaled. I don't remember anything from before the crash. But I remember the first thing I saw when I woke up. She held her breath. You. The single word crashed in her like lightning. Her heart stopped. Nick took a step closer. The space between them shrank. The world blurred, the rain fading into nothing. I didn't wake up because of the company, he murmured. Or because of revenge. His fingers brushed against hers. I woke up because someone stayed. Evelyn's breath came in shaky, uneven bursts. She had spent months by his side, thinking he wasn't aware of her. But he had been. Somewhere in the darkness, he had known. Nick's hand lifted, fingers skimming the side of her face, tracing a raindrop down her cheek. Evelyn. Evil. She closed her eyes. And then... His lips pressed against hers. Soft at first. Just a breath, a hesitation. But then he moved, and suddenly she was drowning. His hand slid around her waist, pulling her against him. His body warm despite the cold rain. She gripped the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. The kiss was nothing like she expected, and everything she needed. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I don't know what happens next, he admitted. Evelyn smiled, tracing her fingers along his jaw. That's the best part, she whispered. Nick exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. And then he kissed her again. There, in the middle of the storm, Nicholas Calloway chose something new. Not revenge. not his past. Her. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting golden hues across the rooftop of the Calloway estate. The world was finally quiet, the chaos of the past months settling into something that almost felt like peace. Nick stood near the edge of the balcony, one hand resting on the cool stone railing, the other tucked into the pocket of his suit. He had spent weeks rebuilding what he had lost: his company, his control, his sense of self, and yet none of it mattered as much as the woman standing a few feet away, looking out at the same horizon. Evelyn. She had been his constant, his anchor, the only person who had seen him at his weakest and never once walked away. He had spent his entire life believing that power was his greatest asset, that strength came from control. But Evelyn had proven him wrong. She had stayed. And because of that, he had survived. He turned to her, watching as the wind tousled her hair, the last remnants of sunlight dancing across her face. She looked peaceful, but he knew better. He knew that beneath that quiet exterior was a woman who had fought for him, even when he had nothing left to fight for himself. His fingers tightened around the object in his pocket. It was time. Nick took a slow breath before stepping closer. "You're quiet." Evelyn glanced at him, smiling softly. "Just thinking." He arched a brow. "That's dangerous." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "It's just... everything's finally over. Your brother is in prison. The company is yours again. You're finally free." Nick studied her for a long moment. "Am I?" Evelyn frowned. "Aren't you?" He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I spent a year in a coma, Evelyn. 14 months where my entire life disappeared. And in all that time, only one thing mattered." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Nick reached into his pocket, fingers curling around the small velvet box. His heart pounded, a foreign sensation for a man who had always been in control. But this wasn't about control. This was about her. Slowly, deliberately, he dropped to one knee. Evelyn's breath caught. The world stood still. Nick flipped open the box, revealing a simple, yet elegant diamond ring, the platinum band glinting under the fading sunlight. But it wasn't the ring that made Evelyn's hands fly to her mouth. It was him. Nicholas Calloway, the man who had fought against death, against betrayal, against his own demons, was looking up at her with something raw, something real. "You didn't just save my life," he murmured. "You became my life." Evelyn's eyes burned. Nick's voice was quiet but steady. "I spent years believing that success, power, and control were all that mattered. But then I lost everything. And the only thing that pulled me back, the only thing that made me want to fight, was you." Her breath hitched. Nick swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the ring. "I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I'll ever be the same man I was before the accident. But I do know one thing." He exhaled, his expression softening. "I know I want you." Evelyn let out a shaky laugh, tears spilling over. Nick gave her a small, lopsided smile. "Marry me." She didn't hesitate. Didn't even let him finish before dropping to her knees, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes." She breathed against his skin. 1,000 times, yes. Nick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, wrapping his arms around her, holding her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered. And maybe she was. The Calloway estate had never looked more radiant than it did on their wedding day. The gardens were transformed into an enchanted wonderland, white roses lining the pathways, twinkling lights draped over towering oak trees. Music played softly in the background, laughter and conversation filling the evening air. Evelyn stood at the grand entrance, her fingers tightening around her bouquet. Her maid of honor, Lisa, leaned in with a smirk. "You look like you're about to run." Evelyn let out a nervous laugh. "Not a chance." Lisa winked. "Good answer." Then the music shifted, and there he was. Nick stood at the altar, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, his blue eyes locked onto hers as if she was the only person in the world. The nerves vanished. Evelyn stepped forward, each step bringing her closer to forever. When she finally reached him, Nick took her hands in his grip firm, steady. The vows were spoken, their promises sealed not just in words, but in every moment leading up to this one. And when the officiant finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Nick didn't hesitate. He cupped her face, pressing the most heartfelt, most meaningful kiss against her lips. The crowd cheered, but Evelyn barely heard them. Because in that moment, nothing else existed except him. Except them. Later that night, after the guests had gone, after the laughter and champagne had faded into soft echoes, Nick and Evelyn stood in the quiet of the garden, hand in hand. Nick squeezed her fingers gently. "You know," he murmured, "I thought I had everything before I met you." Evelyn smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "And now?" Nick looked down at her, his expression soft, devoted, endless. "Now I know that nothing I had before matters." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb tracing her cheek. "Because you are the greatest thing that's ever happened to me." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but she smiled through them, standing on her toes to press a soft kiss to his lips. And as they stepped forward into their forever, she knew. They had been through storms, through darkness, through near-death experiences. But in the end, love had won. And with Nicholas Calloway by her side, Evelyn was finally home. The lesson behind the story. At its core, this story isn't just about romance or revenge. It's about resilience, second chances, and the power of unwavering loyalty. Nicholas Calloway had everything: wealth, power, influence. But when he lost it all, when he was stripped of the things that once defined him, he discovered what truly mattered: not success, not control, but the people who refuse to leave your side when everything else falls apart. Evelyn wasn't just a nurse. She was the one person who saw Nick at his weakest and never turned away. She taught him that love isn't about perfection. It's about standing by someone, even when they're broken, even when they're broken, even when they don't believe in themselves. She proved that love isn't given to those who have it all, but to those who are willing to fight for it. This story reminds us that life can change in an instant. We can lose everything we thought was secure: our careers, our status, even our sense of identity. But what remains? The people who stay, the ones who believe in us when we can't even recognize ourselves. Nick and Evelyn's journey is proof that sometimes what we think is the end is just the beginning. That the darkest moments in our lives can lead us to something far greater than what we lost. And that real love, the kind that lasts, isn't found in grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It's found in the quiet moments, the unwavering devotion, the decision to stay. Because in the end, love isn't about having everything. It's about finding the one person who makes everything worth it. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul, Stirring Stories for more emotional and inspiring tales. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will move your soul. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the most unexpected ways. See you in the next story.